Why was everyone laughing at her? The question hung in the dry morning air, carried by the faint metallic echo of shell casings and desert wind. At the Arsenal Proving Grounds, a vast stretch of concrete and dust shimmering under the sun, ranks of officers and engineers gathered for what was supposed to be a flawless live-fire evaluation. Every camera, every data terminal, every soldier was there to witness the debut of the new M210 enhanced sniper rifle system. It was Captain Bryce Thorne's day, his project, his show, his ladder to promotion. He had orchestrated this test down to the minute, the kind of event that gets written into reports, the kind that earns a handshake from someone in the Pentagon. And then she walked in. She didn't belong, at least not in their eyes. An older woman in an olive-drab maintenance jumpsuit, unadorned by rank or name tag. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair pulled back into a tight bun that suggested function, not vanity. She carried a heavy rifle case like it weighed nothing. Captain Thorne spotted her halfway across the line, his jaw tightening with annoyance. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a live-fire evaluation for the M210, he said, his voice sharp, meant for everyone to hear. Not a bake sale. Are you lost? The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, not yet. It was the nervous, obedient kind of laughter that lives in military spaces. People laughed because their superior officer did. Thorne smirked, hands on his hips, a posture he had practiced for photographs, for authority. His jaw clenched, his boots planted wide, his body screaming confidence. He was the kind of man who thought silence meant agreement. But the woman didn't flinch. She just stood there, calm, still, eyes steady beneath the shadow of her cap. From 200 yards away, in the tall observation tower, Colonel Marcus Vance watched through binoculars. He saw something the captain didn't, something that made him lower the glass and lean forward. It was her stance, her center of gravity. Feet planted perfectly, shoulders squared not with tension but balance. He'd seen that before, decades ago, in places the military doesn't put in brochures. And suddenly, the colonel felt the ghost of recognition stirring. Down on the line, Thorne pressed on, his irritation hardening. "Range control should have stopped you at the gate," he barked. "This area is restricted. We're dealing with classified weapons systems, not exactly a place for sightseeing." The woman said nothing. Her hands, steady, precise, lowered the rifle case to the bench. The motion was too practiced to be casual. It had the weight of ritual. Every click of the latches echoed like punctuation, marks in a sentence she hadn't spoken yet. Someone in the back whispered, "What's she doing?" No one answered. Even the sun seemed to hold still for a moment. Thorne folded his arms, speaking louder, as though volume could disguise insecurity. "Look, I get it," he said with a smirk. "You probably think this is just about pulling a trigger, but this," he gestured at the high-tech screens, wind sensors, chronographs, "this is science. We're validating ballistic coefficients, spin drift, Coriolis effect, applied physics, not something you learn in a weekend safety course." His audience, lieutenants, engineers, sergeants, nodded along, pretending to understand. It was theater, and she was ruining his stage. The woman, Evelyn Reed, though no one knew her name yet, gave no reaction. Her expression remained unreadable. No anger, no amusement, just focus. She unclasped the final latch. The sound cut through the air, crisp and final. The laughter died completely. Even Sergeant Miller, the senior NCO who'd seen 20 years of everything, felt the atmosphere shift. He studied her hands, calloused, scarred, clean but worn by tools, by metal, by time. Those weren't the hands of a desk clerk. Thorne felt the unease too, though he'd never admit it. He needed to regain control. "Sergeant Miller," he barked, "escort this woman back to admin. Find out who let her through. We're on a schedule." Miller hesitated. That 1 second of hesitation told a story all its own. He looked from his captain to the woman, to her hands resting gently on the rifle case, her eyes focused and utterly fearless. She didn't seem threatened. She didn't seem impressed. She seemed in command. "Ma'am," Miller said carefully, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." She didn't even look up. Instead, she lifted the lid. The rifle inside wasn't standard issue. It was something else. The metal was worn in the way old things are, not by neglect, but by mastery. Matte gray, fluted barrel, custom stock, a weapon built by hand, not factory. And etched into the receiver a small emblem, a centaur drawing a bow. An insignia no one recognized. But Colonel Vance did. Up in the tower he froze. He knew that mark. He hadn't seen it in over 10 years. He reached for the radio. "Hold your position," he whispered into the handset. His voice had changed, quieter, heavier. On the firing line, Evelyn began to assemble the weapon with the ease of memory. Her fingers glided across metal, checking tolerances, aligning optics, moving like a pianist lost in her own piece. The bystanders forgot to breathe. They weren't watching someone build a rifle. They were watching someone become it. And then chaos. A shout erupted from the other side of the line. "Rifle 1 is down. I repeat, catastrophic failure." The air broke open. Thorne spun toward the commotion. His top sniper's weapon had jammed solid, bolt seized, extractor claw sheared. A complete system failure. In seconds, the range turned to panic. Technicians scrambled, tools clattering, voices shouting over each other. The high-value Pentagon evaluation, Thorne's masterpiece, was collapsing right in front of him. He tried to fix it, yelling orders, demanding updates, cursing under his breath, but procedure failed him. No manual covered this. And still she worked. Unbothered, unhurried. Evelyn Reed ignored the storm entirely. She lifted her own rifle from the case, the motion fluid, reverent. Attach the bipod, click. Work the bolt, shhh, clack. The sound was too smooth, too perfect. Someone whispered, "That's not standard issue." The crowd began to circle closer, drawn by something they didn't understand. Thorne noticed, his pride boiling over. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, stepping toward her. "This isn't some backyard range. You can't just—" He stopped. Because she wasn't listening. Because she was already prone, sighting in. Her body was still, her breathing measured, her finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. Thorne gave a short, ugly laugh. "You're going to shoot it yourself, save the day." The sarcasm cracked in his voice like brittle glass. She said nothing. The world around her began to disappear. The shouting, the wind, the embarrassment, all fading into silence. Through the scope, there was only the target. 2,200 meters away, a hostage silhouette. A 3-inch bullseye cut from steel, the kill zone. Impossible. The wind was picking up, gusting cross-range. Mirage waves shimmered across the desert floor. Even under ideal conditions, this was a 1-in-a-million shot. But she didn't calculate, she felt. The weight of the wind, the pulse in her fingertips, the mirage shifting left to right. She inhaled, exhaled, and pressed. The rifle exhaled with her. No jerk, no violence, just precision. The crack rolled across the range, a sound like thunder wrapped in silk. Then silence. 1 second. 2. Then ping. A small, clean sound. Metal on metal. The bull's had vanished, punched clean through. For a long moment, no one moved. The desert itself seemed to pause. Sergeant Miller raised his binoculars, his hands trembling. "Center punch," he whispered. "Perfect hit." Thorne's mouth opened, but no words came. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. He turned toward her. But she was already ejecting the spent casing, the tiny bronze cylinder glinting in the sunlight as it spun through the air and landed softly on the concrete. Up in the tower, Colonel Vance set down the binoculars. He pressed a button on the PA. "Captain Thorne," his voice boomed over the loudspeakers, calm, absolute, final. "Stand down." The range fell silent. Vance descended from the tower. Every step down the steel stairs echoed like a drumbeat. The soldiers straightened instinctively. When he reached the line, he didn't look at Thorne. He walked straight to her. Evelyn Reed stood quietly beside her rifle, the wind tugging at her jumpsuit, her expression unchanged. Vance's eyes dropped to the Centaur insignia on the receiver, and for a moment, something old flickered in his face, a memory of battles no one talked about anymore. He nodded once, slowly, respectfully. Then he turned to Thorne. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet, but the kind of quiet that made every muscle on the line lock tight. "For the last hour you've been making a fool of yourself, of your team, of this entire command. You saw an unmarked uniform and thought you understood who stood before you. You saw no rank, so you saw no worth." Thorne's lips parted. "Sir, I—" "Don't," Vance cut him off. "Do you have any idea who you've been talking to?" The captain looked at her, at the plain olive jumpsuit, the scarred hands, the unreadable calm, and realized he didn't. He really didn't. "Sir, no." Vance exhaled, almost a sigh. "No, you wouldn't, because people like her don't show up in your manuals." He turned to face the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, that is Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed." The words landed like artillery. A CW-5, the rarest rank in the entire Army, the top of the technical and tactical pyramid. A master who advised generals. Someone beyond rank, the kind of soldier whose expertise writes the doctrine everyone else follows. The desert wind stirred again. Dust rose around their boots. Captain Thorne stood frozen. Every ounce of arrogance bled from his face. And somewhere deep inside him, shame began to bloom. Colonel Vance straightened his back. Then, in a move that broke every unspoken rule of hierarchy, he raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute. To her. The silence that followed was sacred. A colonel saluting a warrant officer. Every man and woman on that line understood exactly what that meant. And for the first time that day, Evelyn Reed moved. She returned the salute barely, just enough to acknowledge it. Then she turned, picked up her case, and walked away. The echo of her boots across the concrete was the only sound left. No one laughed anymore. Who was she really? The question burned through every corner of the Arsenal proving grounds like wildfire. By sunset, the echo of that single perfect shot had become more than sound. It had become story. Officers whispered it in corridors. Sergeants repeated it in the mess. Recruits passed it like a secret too powerful to keep. The woman in the plain olive jumpsuit, the one they laughed at, had shattered the myth of hierarchy in a single heartbeat. But inside the range control office, the air wasn't filled with awe. It was heavy with shame. Captain Bryce Thorne stood at attention before Colonel Vance's desk, his cap clutched in his hands, his mouth dry as dust. Behind the colonel, through the narrow window, the sky burned red with the dying light, a desert sunset that looked almost biblical. Vance didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of punishment. When he finally spoke, it was with a calm that cut deeper than rage. "Captain," he said, "you understand what you did out there today." Thorne swallowed hard. "Sir, I disrespected a senior." Vance raised a hand. "You didn't just disrespect a senior," he interrupted. "You disrespected competence. You mocked excellence because it didn't wear the kind of uniform you expected." Thorne's throat tightened. There was nothing he could say. You think this is about embarrassment, Vance continued, his voice low but carrying. No, it's about blindness. You saw a woman past 40, no rank, no patch, and you assumed irrelevance. You saw silence and mistook it for weakness, and you did it in front of your men. Every word landed like a slow hammer. Vance leaned forward, his eyes sharp with something beyond anger, disappointment. Do you have any idea who she is? Thorne shook his head, too ashamed to meet his eyes. Vance exhaled, turning slightly toward the window. Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed, he said, almost reverently. Last active graduate of Project Kron. The captain frowned. Sir, I've never heard of. Of course you haven't, Vance cut in. You weren't meant to. He paused, then added, almost like telling a ghost story. Project Kron was a black operations program, classified at the highest level. It was never on record, never briefed to your kind of command. It was an experiment not to build a better weapon, but to build the people who could create one. Thorne blinked, uncertain if he was supposed to believe it. Vance's voice softened, but the weight of history filled it. 4 candidates made it through, 4 ghosts. They were more than snipers, more than armorers. They were craftsmen, engineers, warriors fused into one mind. They could build a rifle from a block of steel, write the software that ran its ballistics, and then hit a moving target 2 kilometers away in a sandstorm. He looked back at Thorne, and you called her lost. Thorne's chest tightened until breathing felt like penance. He saw again her calm expression, her steady hands, the way she'd ignored his every word. She hadn't needed to prove anything. He'd been performing, she'd been preparing. Vance stood and walked to the small cabinet against the wall. From it he took an old wooden box, the kind that seemed to carry stories in its grain. He opened it carefully and pulled out a weathered photograph. It showed 4 people in desert camouflage, faces half hidden by dust and exhaustion. One of them, unmistakably, was Evelyn Reed, decades younger, eyes the same piercing calm. Vance's voice was softer now. I was there when Project Kron shut down. The brass said it was too expensive, too dangerous, too human. They wanted automation, drones, algorithms, but the truth— he looked down at the photograph, the memory cutting through him. The truth is, no machine has ever matched what people like her could do. He set the photo down, then looked up, his voice turning sharp again. Do you understand what she did for you today, Captain? She saved your evaluation, saved your program, saved your reputation, and you humiliated her in the process. Thorne felt the sting of it deep in his stomach. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but every sentence felt hollow. Vance leaned closer. She's staying here for a week. Her orders come from higher than me, so you'll treat her with the respect she earned long before you ever put on that uniform. You will assist her. You will learn from her. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll walk away with something that can't be written in a manual. The colonel's voice dropped to a quiet warning. And Captain, don't try to impress her, just listen. That night, the Arsenal base was restless. The wind howled through the corridors, stirring dust that never really settled. Evelyn Reed worked alone in the maintenance bay. The overhead lights hummed faintly, throwing long shadows over her workbench. The Kron rifle lay disassembled in precise, reverent order, each component gleaming under the lamplight. Her hands moved with practiced calm. She wasn't fixing anything. She was cleaning, maintaining, preserving, like an artist tending to an old instrument. The sound of her movements, cloth on steel, click of metal, breath through silence, was almost meditative. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow, hesitant. She didn't turn. Close the door, Captain. Thorne froze. She hadn't looked up, hadn't seen him, yet she knew. He obeyed quietly. I came to apologize, he said. I know. Her tone wasn't dismissive, it was simply factual. He stood there for a long moment, watching her work. The silence pressed down, broken only by the rhythmic motion of her hands. Finally, she said, "What did you learn today?" The question startled him. "I learned," he paused, "I learned not to underestimate people." She set down the bolt she was cleaning, finally turning to face him. Her eyes met his calm, unflinching, evaluating. "No," she said softly, "that's what you tell yourself. What did you really learn?" He hesitated. Then, with effort, "I learned that I know less than I thought I did." A faint flicker of approval crossed her face. "Better." She turned back to her bench. "The first lesson," she said, "is always the same. Watch, listen, don't talk unless it adds value. The rifle teaches patience before precision." Thorne frowned slightly. "The rifle teaches." She smiled the faintest, tiredest smile. "Everything teaches, Captain. You just have to quiet yourself long enough to hear it." He said nothing. There was nothing to add. For the next several minutes, he just watched. She disassembled the rifle's firing pin assembly, small, complex, almost delicate, and cleaned it with surgical precision. Every motion was deliberate, economical without waste. It wasn't just maintenance. It was ritual. And in that silence, something changed in him. The arrogance that once fueled him began to feel heavy, useless. Finally, she handed him the cleaned bolt, heavy and gleaming in his hands. "The weapon," she said quietly, "is only as good as the hands that maintain it." He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes flicked toward him. "Don't say it because it sounds respectful. Say it because you believe it." He swallowed hard. "I do." She studied him for a long moment, then turned back to her work. "Then we'll see what you're made of." The following morning, the base was alive again, not with laughter but with whispers. Everyone wanted to see her, the ghost, the legend. But Evelyn Reed wasn't interested in spectacle. At dawn, she was already back at the range, alone. The Kron rifle sat before her, ready. She wasn't shooting today. She was observing, recording. Her eyes scanned the horizon, the wind, the dust, measuring variables that most people couldn't see, let alone feel. When Thorne arrived, she didn't look up. "You're late." He glanced at his watch. "Ma'am, it's 600 sharp." "Exactly," she said. "The world doesn't start at your convenience, Captain. It starts when it starts." He didn't reply. She gestured toward a second rifle laid out beside hers, the standard M210. "Show me what you've built." He took position, his hand steady but his mind uneasy. She watched everything, his stance, grip, breathing like a surgeon studying a heartbeat. He fired. The shot rang out cleanly, hitting the target's center mass. "Not bad," she said flatly. "Now tell me what you did wrong." He frowned. "Ma'am, I hit." She cut him off. "You hit paper, that's not the same as hitting truth. What did you feel?" He hesitated. Wind was steady 10 knots from east. "Wind shifts every heartbeat," she said. "You adjusted too late. The rifle told you that before you pulled the trigger." He blinked. "How?" "You weren't listening." The words hit harder than any reprimand. She stepped closer, kneeling beside him, pointing at the rifle. "Precision isn't about control, it's about surrender. You don't fight the conditions, you harmonize with them. You don't command the weapon, you become it." Her tone wasn't poetic, it was absolute, live truth. Thorne listened in silence, realizing how shallow his own understanding had been. "Every round you fire," she said, "is a conversation between you, the wind, the steel, and the earth beneath your feet. If you're not listening to all of them, you're talking to yourself." He nodded, quietly humbled. For the first time, her words didn't sound like riddles. They sounded like reality. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right," she said, "let's begin again." As the day wore on, word spread that Captain Thorne, the man who once mocked her, was now training under her. No one dared laugh this time. because everyone had seen what she could do. But what most didn't understand was that her power didn't come from the rifle or her rank. It came from the way she carried herself, steady, unshaken, self-contained. When she walked across the range, soldiers stopped talking. Not out of fear, out of respect. And when she spoke, even the wind seemed to quiet down to listen. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hangars, Thorn stayed long after everyone else was gone. He sat alone at the firing bench, replaying her words. The desert was silent. But for the first time in his life, he understood what she meant. That silence wasn't empty. It was full, full of truth. He closed his eyes and whispered to no one. Watch, listen, don't speak. And for the first time, he finally did. Why did she choose to teach him at all? That question haunted Bryce Thorn from the moment she handed him the bolt. He had spent years building a career on authority, on giving orders, on being obeyed. Now, he found himself being remade under the quiet discipline of a woman who spoke only when she had something worth saying. Every morning began before dawn. Before the hum of generators, before the base stirred to life, she was already at the range. Her schedule was a ghost's. She didn't seem to sleep. Sometimes he would arrive early and still find her there, already kneeling by the rifle, the horizon behind her a thin blade of pink light. Always focused, always silent. She didn't instruct like an officer. She didn't bark commands. She asked questions, small, piercing questions that left him exposed. What did you feel in that shot? What did you ignore? Why did you think you were ready? Each one felt less like a test of skill and more like a mirror. At first, he tried to answer in military language, talking about wind correction, sight alignment, range variables. But she'd just shake her head. No, Captain, that's not what I asked. You're describing data. I asked about awareness. Awareness. He didn't understand it, not at first. Until one morning, the third day, she changed everything. Leave the rifle, she said. He blinked. Ma'am. You heard me, no weapon today. She started walking toward the desert. He followed. They moved in silence for almost a mile, the wind rising around them, dry and sharp. The air tasted of metal and dust. Finally, she stopped, right where the sand gave way to cracked rock. Listen, she said. He frowned. To what? Exactly, she murmured. That's the problem, you don't hear it. Thorn stood there, confused, his boots crunching lightly on the stone. The wind, she said quietly. The mirage, the earth beneath you. They're talking all the time. Every variable that affects a shot, temperature, pressure, echo, terrain, it's all here. But you have to listen to the environment before you can control it. Otherwise, you're just another man firing blind. He glanced around. The desert stretched endlessly. Still, he closed his eyes. And for the first time, he truly listened. He could hear the wind whispering against his jacket, the faint hum of far-off generators, the low vibration of something beneath the ground, maybe trucks in the distance, maybe his own pulse. He realized how much noise he carried inside him, the ego, the chatter, the urge to speak. And when he finally quieted it, the desert made sense. When he opened his eyes again, she was watching him, not with approval but with recognition. You're beginning to hear it, she said softly. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. Later that morning, they returned to the range. The heat had risen, warping the air, shimmering like liquid glass. She handed him the rifle, not the Kron, but the standard M210. Now shoot, she said. No spotter, no data, just what you feel. He looked at her, uncertain. How far? She gestured to the desert. You tell me. He lined up the scope, gauging the target by instinct. 2 seconds passed, then 3. He adjusted slightly, exhaled and fired. The round cut the air with a clean, confident crack. The steel target rang a heartbeat later. He lowered the rifle, surprised. A perfect hit. She didn't react. She simply nodded toward the horizon. Do it again. He chambered another round, fired again. Another hit. Again. A third, a fourth. Each one a clean center strike. He began to feel it, that rhythm, that stillness between thought and action. When the magazine emptied, he exhaled hard, adrenaline humming in his veins. He looked at her, expecting a word of approval. Instead, she said, "Now tell me how many shots you missed." He blinked. "I didn't miss any, ma'am." She turned to him slowly, her eyes cold, steady. "Yes, you did," she said. "You missed all of them." He frowned, stunned. "Ma'am, You missed because you weren't learning. You were performing. You hit the target, but you didn't understand the rifle. You didn't feel what made each round different. You didn't ask why the third sounded flatter, why the last one broke slower. You were chasing approval, not awareness." Her words were merciless and true. He felt the shame rise in him again, raw and hot. I wanted to prove." She cut him off. "That's the disease, Captain, the need to prove. It kills more soldiers than bullets." The desert wind whipped past them, tugging at their uniforms. She turned back toward the bench, disassembling the rifle with the same calm precision. Thorne stood in silence, his confidence collapsing, replaced by something unfamiliar, humility. That evening she spoke again, softer this time. "You think your lesson started when I corrected you," she said, eyes on the sunset. "It didn't. It started when I watched you mock a stranger in front of your men." He flinched, the memory still burned. "Leadership," she said, "isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens the deepest." She looked at him then, her gaze not angry, just tired. "You have potential, but potential isn't virtue. It's debt. You owe something for having it, to the people you lead, to the people you fail, and to yourself." The words sank into him like slow rain. He didn't speak, he didn't argue. For once, silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like growth. As days passed, the rhythm of their mentorship deepened. He began to notice things he'd never seen before. The way she would pause before firing, almost imperceptibly, as if aligning her heartbeat with the wind. The way she cleaned her rifle, each motion deliberate and precise, never hurried. It wasn't just skill, it was philosophy. She didn't serve the weapon, she became it. He began to realize that her calm wasn't detachment, it was mastery. And beneath it there was something else, something broken. Sometimes, in the quiet hours between drills, he would catch her staring out toward the horizon, her expression unreadable, haunted. Once he found her sitting alone in the armory, holding a small, dented brass casing between her fingers, turning it slowly, as if it held a memory too heavy to speak aloud. He wanted to ask, but something told him not to. Still, the question burned in him. What had she seen? What had she lost? On the fifth day, he found the courage to ask. They were cleaning weapons in silence when he finally said, "Ma'am, may I ask you something?" "You just did," she said dryly without looking up. He smiled faintly. "Why do you do this? Why come back? You could have stayed invisible." She paused. For a long time she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, "Because the wrong people were being promoted." He looked up. "Because too many loud men thought rank meant wisdom," she continued. "And too many quiet experts stopped trying to be heard. That imbalance gets people killed, Captain. So when they asked me to evaluate your program, I said yes. But I wasn't here to evaluate a rifle. I was here to measure the people holding it." Her voice was calm, but the edge in it could cut steel. "And?" he asked softly. Her eyes met his. "So far, one of them is starting to wake up." He understood then. This wasn't just about teaching him to shoot. It was about rebuilding him from the inside out. That night he couldn't sleep. The barracks felt too small, too sterile. He walked outside into the open desert. The stars above were brutal in their clarity, infinite and cold. He remembered her words, awareness, listen, stop proving. He kneeled, picked up a handful of sand, and let it fall slowly through his fingers. Each grain caught the moonlight like a spark. For the first time, he understood how small he really was, and how much he had to learn. The next morning, Evelyn was already waiting at the range. The Kron rifle, her rifle, lay on the bench. It hadn't been touched since the day of the impossible shot. She looked at him. Today you'll fire it. He froze. Ma'am, that's your weapon. She nodded. Yes, and now it's your responsibility. He stepped closer, hesitant. It wasn't just a rifle, it was history, myth, the weapon that had silenced an entire base. Understand something before you touch it, she said. This weapon doesn't forgive arrogance. It magnifies it. If you bring ego to the shot, it will show you who you really are. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He took position. The rifle was heavier than he expected, solid, balanced, alive. He breathed in slowly. The world narrowed to the reticle. His pulse slowed. He felt the wind shift. He adjusted barely and fired. The recoil was smooth, a single heartbeat of power. The steel target rang, but not center. An inch high. He exhaled, disappointed. But when he looked at her, she wasn't angry. She was smiling faintly but real. Finally, she said. He frowned. I missed. Yes, she said softly, and that means you're human again. She took the rifle from him gently, laying it back into its case. The perfect shot isn't about perfection, Captain. It's about honesty. Every round you fire tells you who you are in that moment. Most people just don't want to listen. He stood in silence, the truth settling deep. As the sun dipped below the ridges, casting long shadows across the range, she packed the rifle away. Tomorrow, she said, you'll stop shooting entirely. You'll start fixing. He blinked. Fixing. She nodded. You'll learn to build what you break. That's how you earn respect, not by pulling a trigger, but by understanding what it costs when you do. And with that, she walked off into the falling light. The wind picked up again, sweeping across the range, whispering through the brass casings scattered on the ground. And for the first time, Captain Bryce Thorne didn't hear noise. He heard lesson. How do you rebuild something you broke without realizing it? That question haunted Captain Bryce Thorne as he walked into the maintenance hangar the next morning. The workshop was silent except for the rhythmic hum of a ventilation fan and the faint clink of metal. Evelyn Reed stood at a long bench under a single lamp, sleeves rolled, goggles perched on her forehead. She was surrounded by the smell of gun oil, solvent, and steel scents that felt ancient, like the perfume of forgotten wars. She didn't look up when he entered. You're late. He glanced at his watch, 5:58. 2 minutes early, ma'am. Late, she repeated flatly. The tools were ready at 5:45. The rifle doesn't wait on your schedule. He opened his mouth to reply, then thought better of it. On the table before her lay the Kron rifle, fully disassembled, each piece laid out with surgical precision. Every screw, pin, and spring in perfect order, like words in a language only she spoke fluently. You said we were fixing today, Thorne said carefully. Evelyn nodded. We are, but first you're going to ruin something. He frowned. Ruin. She gestured to a half-assembled bolt assembly on the secondary bench. That's a standard M210 bolt group. I want you to take it apart and put it back together until it fails. He hesitated, intentionally. Yes. He waited for explanation. None came. So he obeyed. He broke it down, cleaned it, reassembled it again and again. After an hour, his fingers ached. The metal grew slick with oil and frustration. Finally, a spring slipped and launched across the room, pinging off the wall. Evelyn didn't react. There it is, she said quietly, the failure. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I should have been more careful. No, she said, you should have been less perfect. He looked up, confused. She leaned over the table, voice low but steady. Perfection hides mistakes. Failure reveals them. You'll never master something you're afraid to break. Her words lingered. Then, without warning, she picked up the Kron rifle's bolt, the same one she had trusted him to hold days before, and handed it to him. Now fix this. He blinked. What's wrong with it? She smiled faintly. That's what you're supposed to find out. For the next several hours, the workshop became a world of silence and focus. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed distant, almost unreal. Thorn worked carefully, examining, testing, measuring until his eyes blurred. He couldn't find a single flaw. Every surface was polished, every spring tensioned perfectly. He finally exhaled in frustration. Ma'am, I can't see what's wrong. Evelyn stepped closer, taking the bolt from his hands. She turned it slowly under the lamp, her thumb brushing over the grooves like a pianist reading a note by touch. You didn't look, she said softly. You inspected, there's a difference. She held the bolt against the light, and he saw it barely visible, a faint hairline fracture running along the extractor claw. How did you see that? I didn't, she said. I felt it. You'll learn to see with more than your eyes. He nodded quietly, humbled. She placed the bolt back in his hand. Now repair it. He hesitated. This part's custom machined. Replacing it would mean. She interrupted. It means nothing. Replace it if you can't rebuild it, but either way make it right. He worked through the rest of the day, machining, filing, aligning, until sweat ran down his neck and his hands trembled. Each motion was careful, deliberate, precise. By late afternoon, he set the repaired bolt on the bench. Evelyn examined it silently, then nodded once. Good. She didn't praise him. She didn't need to. As she cleaned up her tools, Thorn gathered the courage to ask what had been building in him for days. Ma'am, what was Project Kron really? For a moment she didn't answer. The sound of the fan filled the silence. Then she said, it started as a dream. She leaned back against the bench, her voice turning distant, reflective. Years ago, when the wars were young, Command thought they could create perfect soldiers, not through breeding or conditioning, but through craftsmanship. People who could build, modify, and wield anything. They wanted warriors who could think like engineers and engineers who could fight like warriors. She picked up the repaired bolt, turning it in her fingers. They called it Project Kron, named after the centaur. Half craftsman, half hunter. 4 of us graduated, only 4. Her tone darkened. They shut us down 2 years later, too expensive, too independent. They said machines could do it cheaper. Thorn listened, transfixed. And the others, what happened to them? Her eyes clouded. 2 died in the field, 1 disappeared, that leaves me. She didn't elaborate, she didn't need to. The weight in her voice said enough. Then she added quietly, we weren't supposed to exist anymore. But every few years, someone in the Pentagon remembers what human skill can do when the technology fails. That's when they send for the ghosts. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Ghosts of the Forge, he murmured, recalling the colonel's words. She nodded faintly. That's what they called us. Not soldiers, not scientists, just ghosts. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. The next morning the lesson continued, but differently. When Thorn arrived, she wasn't at the bench. She was outside, kneeling on the concrete near the brass memorial plate, the one engraved with the words "Competence is quiet." She was cleaning it with a rag and a small bottle of oil, the way one might tend a gravestone. He stood at a respectful distance. I didn't know we maintained that daily, he said softly. We don't, she replied. I do. He hesitated. Why? She didn't look up, because someone should. The words landed heavy, simple, absolute. She straightened, wiping her hands, then nodded toward the range. You'll fire again today, but not for precision, for reflection. Reflection. You'll take the same shot you missed yesterday, she said. But this time, I want you to think about everyone who taught you, every sergeant, every instructor, every mistake you ever made. Then decide who you're shooting for. He didn't understand, not fully, but he obeyed. He took his position. The desert air shimmered. He chambered a round, lined up his sights. He exhaled just like she'd taught. And for a moment, a brief, perfect heartbeat, he felt something align. Not calculation, not confidence. Connection. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the vast emptiness. When the sound faded, she asked, "Who did you shoot for?" He swallowed. "For my father," he said quietly. "He was a mechanic, worked his whole life fixing other people's mistakes. I used to think that wasn't honorable enough. Now I think I was wrong." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You just learned more about leadership in 10 seconds than most officers learn in 10 years. That night, they sat outside the hangar under the desert stars. A rare quiet evening. No drills, no schedule, just wind and sky. Thorne finally asked, "You've seen things, haven't you? Things that don't make it into after-action reports." She was silent for a long time, then she nodded slowly. "Yes." He waited. Finally, she said, "I once took a shot I shouldn't have." He turned toward her, but her eyes were somewhere far away. "It was in the Hindu Kush," she continued, voice low. "We had intel on a high-value target. They said he was responsible for hundreds of deaths. We had one window. I took it." She paused, the wind whispering through the silence. "When we reached the site," she said, "there was no insurgent, just his son, a boy, 12. The words hit like a slow blade. Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. "Jesus," he whispered. She nodded once, eyes glinting with the faintest moisture. "I built the rifle that fired that round. I wrote the algorithm that guided it. Every inch of it was mine, my work, my calculation." She looked down at her hands, scarred and steady. "These hands." She fell silent again. The desert around them seemed to lean in to listen. Thorne wanted to say something, anything, but no words felt right. After a long time, she said, almost to herself, "Mastery without morality is just engineering. Skill without conscience is just precision. That was the day I stopped chasing perfect shots. That was the day I started teaching instead." The confession hung in the air, quiet and heavy as prayer. Then she added, "Don't ever confuse accuracy with wisdom, Captain. They're not the same thing." He nodded, his throat tight. Understood. They sat in silence after that. For the first time, he saw her not as a legend or a ghost, but as a human being carrying ghosts of her own. He realized that everything she taught, patience, listening, humility, came from pain, not pride. And as he looked out over the desert where her single perfect shot had silenced an entire base, he understood the real lesson she'd been teaching him from the beginning. Perfection isn't the absence of failure. It's the courage to face what failure costs. Later, as they walked back toward the barracks, she stopped and said quietly, "Tomorrow's your last day under me. After that, I move on." He nodded, though something in his chest twisted. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. "Don't say goodbye tomorrow," she said softly. "Just do the work, that's all that ever matters." And she turned and disappeared into the night, her silhouette swallowed by the desert wind, like she'd never been there at all. Thorne stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. He realized he'd stopped fearing silence. Because now he understood what it carried. It wasn't emptiness. It was legacy. How do you know when a lesson is over? That question circled Captain Bryce Thorne's mind all night. He didn't sleep much, not after hearing what she'd said about the boy. That kind of truth didn't let you rest. It found a corner inside you and kept whispering. By dawn, the sky was washed in pale gold. The air was cold, still heavy with the scent of oil and dust. He walked to the range before sunrise and found her already there, as always. But this time, something was different. She wasn't behind a bench. She was standing in the middle of the line, staring out at the target field like she was saying goodbye to it. The Kron rifle was packed away in its case. Only a single sidearm rested on the table beside her, standard issue, unremarkable yet spotless. When she heard him approach, she spoke without turning. "Today isn't about rifles." He stopped beside her. "Then what's it about?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "It's about decisions, the kind you make before you ever pick up a weapon." He waited. She turned finally, her face framed by the rising light, making the lines around her eyes look almost like scars carved by time. "Every soldier faces two wars, Captain," she said. "The one outside and the one inside. Most never win the second." He nodded slowly, unsure if she wanted an answer. She gestured toward the far targets, barely visible through the haze. "You've spent days listening to the wind, watching the mirage, learning to read the earth. But have you learned to read yourself?" He swallowed, the question settling deep. "I'm trying, ma'am." "Good," she said. "Then today you'll prove it." She led him to the armory. The steel door creaked open, revealing rows of weapons gleaming under cold light. On the central table lay two M210 rifles, one his, one newly issued, identical in design, indistinguishable to the untrained eye. Evelyn placed a folder beside them. "Inside this file," she said, "are two field reports. Both describe the same operation, both signed by two different officers. One report blames a system malfunction. The other blames operator error. One of those officers is lying. Your job is to find out which one and fix the mistake." Thorne frowned. "How am I supposed to?" She stopped him with a raised hand. "By using what you've learned, observation, listening, truth before pride." He opened the folder. The operation described a failed weapons test. A sniper had misfired during a live-fire demo, injuring a technician. Both rifles had been cleared and logged afterward. Both passed inspection. The data looked clean, too clean. He looked up. "What am I missing?" "Nothing," she said. "You're just not seeing it yet." She left him alone in the armory. Hours passed. He compared, measured, disassembled, reassembled. Every pin, spring, and bearing matched perfectly until he reached the bolt carrier group of the second rifle. They're faint but unmistakable, a microfracture in the locking lug. Hairline, invisible without touch. His stomach sank. That defect would have caused an overpressure spike on the shot. It wasn't operator error. It was a mechanical flaw. He realized what that meant. The officer who'd taken the blame, the younger lieutenant who'd been demoted and reassigned, hadn't failed at all. He'd been covering for the armorer. He looked up at Evelyn, who was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him quietly. "You knew," he said. "Of course," she replied. "I wanted to see if you would." He exhaled slowly, anger and admiration colliding inside him. Someone took a career-ending hit for a mistake that wasn't his. She nodded once. "Integrity hurts more than failure." Thorne shook his head. "Why didn't command fix this?" "They don't fix truth," she said. "They bury it until someone refuses to shovel." Her eyes locked on his. "So, Captain, what would you do?" He hesitated. "I'd write a correction, submit the new findings." She tilted her head slightly. "That's protocol. What about leadership?" He frowned. "Protocol is easy," she said. "Leadership is doing the right thing when everyone above you would rather you didn't." Her tone softened. "You still think this is about rifles?" He didn't answer, he didn't have to. Because suddenly he understood. This was never about weapons. It was about character. That afternoon, Thorne stood before Colonel Vance's office. The folder felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it should have. He knocked once and entered. Vance looked up from his desk, brows raised. "Captain." Thorne set the folder down. "Sir, there's a discrepancy in the armory report. The malfunction wasn't operator error. It was a structural defect in the bolt carrier. The blame report is false." Vance's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly did you determine that?" "With Chief Reed's oversight, sir," Thorne said evenly. For a long time the colonel said nothing. Then he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "You realize reopening this will cause problems," he said. "Paperwork, scrutiny. That lieutenant's already been reassigned." "Yes, sir," Thorne said quietly, "but it's the truth." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Captain, I'll forward your findings. But understand this, the truth doesn't make friends up the chain. You sure you want to own it?" Thorne met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. Someone taught me the cost of silence." Vance's eyes softened with a trace of a smile. "I see she's had an effect on you." Thorne allowed himself a faint grin. "Yes, sir, a permanent one." He left the office lighter than when he entered. That evening, he found Evelyn at her bench again, reassembling the Kron rifle piece by piece. "I told the colonel," he said. "She didn't stop working, and he's reopening the case." "Good," she said. He hesitated. "You knew that's what I'd do." She looked up, meeting his eyes with that same measured calm. "No," she said. "I hoped. There's a difference." Her hands kept moving, swift and sure. "You're learning to see things as they are, not as you want them to be. That's what separates leaders from officers." Thorne nodded, watching the way her fingers worked. "Are you always this hard on people?" "Only the ones worth the effort." He smiled at that. She slid the rifle's bolt into place with a clean click. "There," she said, "it's ready." "For what?" he asked. She straightened slowly. "For the next person who needs to learn." He realized what she meant. She was leaving. The next morning came too fast. The air was cool, the sun barely risen. The range lay empty except for a single table, a small wooden box, and a folded note. Evelyn was gone. Thorne stood there for a long time before picking up the note. It was handwritten, clean block letters, precise. "Captain, the work continues. You'll know what to do with it." He read. Inside the box was the Kron rifle's firing pin, polished, gleaming like silver under the dawn light. Not the weapon itself, just its heart. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it and the trust behind it. He understood what it meant. The rifle could fire again, but it wouldn't, not without her. And that was the point. It wasn't about the shot anymore. It was about the standard. Later that day, he found Colonel Vance standing near the brass memorial plate. The colonel didn't turn as Thorne approached. "She left early," Vance said quietly. "Didn't even check out through command, just gone." Thorne nodded. "That sounds like her." Vance chuckled under his breath. "You know, I've seen legends come and go, Captain, most fade, but her kind, they echo." He looked down at the engraved words, "Competence is quiet." "She asked us to leave it that way," he said. "No plaque, no story, just silence." Thorne stared at the plate, its surface glinting faintly in the sun. "I think that's exactly what she wanted remembered." Vance nodded. "I think so too." That evening, the captain returned to the workshop. He placed the firing pin in a small display case beside the bolt he'd repaired, 2 pieces of steel, side by side. A symbol not of weapons, of humility. He sat for a while in the quiet, the smell of oil and metal filling the air. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the concrete, carrying the faint echo of her voice. Watch, listen, don't speak unless it adds value. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, not because he'd mastered something, but because he finally understood what mastery required: silence, patience, and the courage to act when no one else would. A week later, a transport drone delivered an encrypted message to the Arsenal base. It was marked classified EYES only. Colonel Vance opened it, scanning quickly, then looked up at Thorne. "She's been reassigned," he said. "To where?" The colonel folded the message. "It doesn't say. Somewhere far away, somewhere that still needs fixing." Thorne smiled faintly. "Then she's exactly where she belongs." Vance nodded, then looked out toward the empty range. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "You can hear the difference when she's gone. The place sounds louder now." Thorne followed his gaze, the wind sweeping across the flat expanse. And he understood what the colonel meant. The noise had come back, the chatter, the ego, the bravado. But somewhere inside all that sound, he could still hear her silence. And he promised himself he'd keep it alive. Sometimes a teacher leaves not to vanish, but to let the echo of their lesson do the talking. Her absence wasn't emptiness. It was instruction. Every soldier who passed the firing line felt it, that quiet hum of respect that lingered like the aftershock of thunder. Evelyn Reed was gone, but her voice, calm, measured, eternal, stayed. And in that silence, new leaders began to listen. How do you rebuild a place when the person who taught you has vanished? That thought followed Captain Bryce Thorne long after Evelyn Reed's departure. The base looked the same: the sand, the steel, the smell of hot oil and discipline, but something invisible had shifted. Everywhere he walked, silence lingered in her absence. The gossip had already evolved into legend. Some said she'd been recalled to a black-budget project overseas. Others whispered she'd gone rogue again, working off-grid for some clandestine command. No one really knew. What they did know was that Range 12 no longer felt ordinary. The brass plate at the center of the line gleamed in the sun. Competence is quiet. It wasn't just words anymore, it was culture. Thorne visited the plate every morning before work. Not as ritual, as reminder. He still heard her voice in the back of his mind. Watch, listen, don't speak unless it adds value. Weeks passed. The Arsenal base settled back into its rhythm, but Thorne no longer fit the pattern he once embodied. He stopped lecturing in meetings, stopped competing for visibility. Instead, he began asking questions. At first, his officers were confused. A captain who listened more than he spoke. Unnerving. When a young sergeant offered an idea, Thorne didn't cut him off. He said, "Show me." When the logistics team complained about outdated procedures, he invited them to write their own improvement plan, and then helped them get it approved. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations replaced orders. Questions replaced arguments. The same lieutenants who once laughed at a woman in a jumpsuit now used her name with quiet respect. The turning point came 3 months later. A new testing cycle had begun for the M210 system. Dozens of eyes, Pentagon observers, defense contractors, journalists, descended on the range. Pressure cameras, expectation. It was exactly the kind of event that used to inflate Thorne's ego. But this time he stood differently. Hands steady, voice calm, focused not on spectacle but on precision. His team, made up of both seasoned NCOs and fresh recruits, moved like a single organism. They had trained not just for success, but for composure. Before the test began, Thorne walked to the line and addressed them quietly. "Listen up," he said. "This demonstration isn't about showing off a weapon. It's about showing who we are when things go wrong. He paused, scanning their faces. If a system fails, we fix it. If a teammate struggles, we steady them. No arrogance, no excuses, just clarity. A long silence followed, respectful, focused. Then one of the younger snipers spoke. "Sir, that's the Reed way, right?" Thorne's lips curved slightly. "It's the right way." The test began. Everything unfolded smoothly for the first hour. Then the heat rose, temperatures spiking above 100, and the electronic wind sensors began to flicker. A contractor panicked. Data feeds dropped. The range monitors went dark. A few years ago, Thorne would have barked orders, demanded control. Now he simply turned to his team. "Manual mode," he said, "revert to analog." Within seconds, soldiers recalibrated the system using physical wind flags and range cards, skills Evelyn had drilled into him that first week. The observers whispered among themselves, impressed. The rest of the evaluation ran on instinct and muscle memory. When the final round hit its mark, the applause from the sidelines felt almost irrelevant. Thorne wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at his people. Their discipline. Their calm. Their quiet. He could almost hear her voice again. "The weapon is only as good as the hands that maintain it." That night, after the successful test, Thorne gathered his officers in the mess hall. He placed a small object on the table, the Kron rifle's firing pin, sealed in its clear case. "Some of you know what this is," he said softly. "Some of you only know the story. Either way, it's why this team works." The room grew still. He told them the story from the beginning, not the legend, not the gossip, but the truth. How he'd mocked her. How she'd humbled him. How the colonel had saluted a ghost. He didn't spare himself. He described every mistake, every blind assumption, every lesson she'd burned into him. By the end, no one moved. He looked around the table. "From now on, every officer who joins this command will learn her principles before they learn their protocol. We'll call it the Reed Line Doctrine." Someone murmured, "Sir, is that official policy?" Thorne smiled faintly. "Not yet, but it will be." Over the following months, change rippled outward. Drill instructors began incorporating read checks, moments of enforced silence before and after each firing sequence. Maintenance crews started holding short workshops where junior soldiers could teach seniors something new they'd discovered. The base became less about command hierarchy, more about shared mastery. One afternoon, Colonel Vance visited the range unannounced. He watched from the observation tower as a group of cadets trained under Thorne's supervision. When the session ended, the colonel descended the stairs, his boots echoing on steel. "You've turned this place inside out," he said, half smiling, "and for once I approve." Thorne nodded. "Just doing what she started, sir." Vance's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Funny, I've been in this uniform 30 years. I thought I'd seen leadership. Then I watched her. Now I watch you. You're not shouting, but everyone's following." Thorne met his eyes. "That's because it's not about volume, sir. It's about truth." The colonel chuckled softly. "Careful, Captain. You keep talking like that and they'll make you a major." Thorne smiled. "If that happens, sir, I'll owe her another salute." Late that night, after the colonel left, Thorne stayed alone at the range. The desert was quiet, wind tracing soft lines across the sand, stars bright and merciless. He set the firing pin beside him on the bench and whispered, "You were right, Chief. The shot isn't what matters, the echo is." He thought of the boy and the story she'd told him, the mistake that had turned her into a teacher. He realized she'd spent the rest of her life firing redemptive shots, not bullets, but lessons. He wondered if she knew what she'd built here, an invisible weapon of culture sharper than any round ever chambered. A few weeks later, he received a sealed envelope. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a workshop, dusty, remote, somewhere overseas. In the background, barely visible, stood a woman in a faded olive jumpsuit, instructing two soldiers over a bench. The handwriting on the back was brief. Different desert, same lesson. Keep the line straight. No signature. He smiled, folded the photo carefully, and placed it in the display beside the firing pin. The next morning, he stood once again before a new class of recruits. Their faces were young, eager, uncertain, the same way his had been not so long ago. He led them to the brass plate in the concrete. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "A woman stood here and reminded us that skill outranks ego every time. Remember that before you ever raise a weapon, because someday you'll stand where she stood, and what you do here will echo long after you're gone." He paused. "Competence is quiet," he said. "Respected." He let the silence hang, thick and reverent, before turning away. The cadets didn't move for several seconds. Then one of them, barely out of high school, murmured, "Sir, did she really hit the target at 2,200? Thorne smiled. "She didn't hit it," he said. "She redefined it." That evening, a soft breeze swept across Range 12, catching the edges of the brass plate and making it glimmer in the fading sun. Some swore they could almost hear another shot roll across the horizon, distant, ghostly, impossible. Maybe it was wind. Maybe memory. But everyone who'd ever learned under her knew better. It was a reminder. A whisper. A challenge. Because every time someone stood on that spot, they weren't just firing rounds. They were measuring themselves against the silence she left behind. And in that silence, new leaders were being forged. One lesson at a time. One act of quiet competence at a time. The legend of Chief Warrant Officer Evelyn Reed had become something greater than rumor. It had become foundation. What happens when the truth you protect begins to threaten your position? That question began to shadow Captain Bryce Thorne the moment the first memo arrived. It was stamped confidential, internal audit, and came from a major he'd never met. The language was polite, bureaucratic, and poisoned. Subject: review of Reed Line Doctrine at Arsenal Base. Concerns have been raised regarding non-standard training practices and unsanctioned cultural reforms. Please prepare documentation for inspection. Thorne read it twice, the words blurred in the fluorescent light. He wasn't surprised. It was only a matter of time before the system noticed. But he wasn't ready for how small the challenge looked on paper. They called her life's work non-standard. He folded the memo neatly and set it aside. For the first time in months, the silence of his office felt heavy again. By the time the auditors arrived, Range 12 had become something of a pilgrimage site. Soldiers from other bases came to train there, to learn her philosophy firsthand. The brass plate gleamed brighter than ever, its engraved words polished daily by recruits who didn't even know why they did it, only that it mattered. Competence is quiet. But the inspectors weren't here for reverence. They came with clipboards and sterile smiles. Major Heller, the lead auditor, shook Thorne's hand with mechanical politeness. "Captain," he said, "we're here to make sure everything you're running aligns with doctrinal standards, nothing personal." "Of course," Thorne said evenly. Heller's gaze drifted to the range beyond the glass. "Impressive record you've built. Lowest misfire rate in the region, top scores in precision drills. Must be nice having a cult of efficiency." Thorne stiffened. "It's not a cult, Major, it's discipline." Heller smirked. "Depends who writes the report." The audit began. They questioned everything: training logs, maintenance protocols, even the ritual moments of silence before drills. "Why the pause?" Heller asked. Thorne answered without hesitation: "To steady the mind." Not standard procedure, Heller noted. Neither is competence, Thorne said. The major looked up from his clipboard, eyes narrowing. You sound like her. Thorne met his gaze calmly. That's the idea. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, whispers rippled through the base that command might dissolve the Reed line entirely. Some officers sided with Thorne, others predictably didn't. They said he'd gone soft, said he was building a philosophy, not a unit. He ignored them. Until one night, Colonel Vance called him in. The old man looked tired, his desk littered with paper and half-drunk coffee. "Sit down, Bryce," he said quietly. Thorne obeyed. "They're not happy upstairs," Vance said. "The doctrine's attracting attention, and not the good kind. Some people think you're trying to turn this into a movement." Thorne frowned. "It's not a movement, sir, it's respect." "I know that," Vance said, "but they don't care. You're drawing lines they don't understand." Silence stretched. Finally, Thorne asked, "What do you need me to do?" The colonel sighed. "Tone it down, at least until the audit over. Stop the stories, the recitations, the—" He gestured vaguely. "The legend building." Thorne hesitated. "Sir, we can't erase her." Vance's voice dropped. "I'm not asking you to erase her. I'm asking you to protect her. You think she'd want her name weaponized against the very thing she stood for." Thorne fell silent. The colonel leaned forward. "Let me handle the politics. You just keep doing the work quietly." It was that last word, quietly, that struck deepest. Evelyn's word. Thorne nodded. "Understood, sir." But it wasn't that simple. Because within days, the auditors started questioning soldiers directly. They interviewed snipers, mechanics, techs, asking about unauthorized methods, unconventional drills. One of them, a young corporal named Dana, came to Thorne afterward shaken. "They wanted me to say, 'You forced us to pray before firing, sir.'" Thorne blinked. "Pray?" She nodded. "That's what they think the silence is for." He exhaled hard. "It's not prayer, it's awareness." "I told them that," she said. "But they don't care. They've already decided what story they're writing." By the second week, he was summoned to the regional command center for an inquiry. The room was cold, impersonal metal table, 3 officers across from him, each wearing the same expressionless mask. "Captain Thorne," one began, "you've introduced non-regulation practices into official marksmanship training. Explain." He spoke calmly. He told them about discipline, focus, patience, about the way silence improved accuracy and morale. He even quoted data, performance metrics, reduced error rates, lower mental fatigue scores. But they weren't listening. One of them, a brigadier with a clipped tone, leaned forward. "And this Chief Warrant Officer Reed, was she authorized to conduct such instruction?" "She was authorization," Thorne said. "Not according to our records. She wasn't listed under any active training command. No orders, no clearance, nothing." Thorne frowned. "That's impossible. She worked under Colonel Vance's authority." The brigadier exchanged a look with the others. "Colonel Vance is being questioned separately. For now, we're asking you, on whose authority did you implement her methods?" Thorne hesitated. He could lie. He could say it was an informal mentorship. He could protect himself. But he remembered her voice. "Leadership is doing the right thing when everyone above you would rather you didn't." So he told the truth. "On mine," he said. The room went still. He returned to the base that evening, exhausted. The sun had dipped low, painting the desert blood orange. He walked straight to Range 12. It was empty, silent, peaceful. He knelt by the brass plate and rested a hand on the cool metal. "What would you do now?" he murmured. The wind answered with a soft sigh, dry sand brushing against his boots. He closed his eyes, imagining her voice. "You don't protect a principle by hiding it. You protect it by living it." He exhaled slowly. Then I guess we keep living it. The next morning, before drills began, he gathered the entire company. They formed a semicircle around the firing line, uncertain why they'd been called early. Thorne stood before them, shoulders squared, eyes steady. "You've probably heard about the audit," he began. "You've probably heard the rumors too, so here's the truth." He paused. "Command doesn't like what we're doing here. They think it's unorthodox. They think silence means weakness. They think reflection means hesitation." He let the words hang. "But we know better. We know what this discipline costs. We know what it builds." He looked around, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "Chief Reed taught us something this military seems to have forgotten, that excellence isn't about who shouts loudest. It's about who steadies first." The air was thick with quiet respect. "So if they strip this doctrine, if they erase her name from the files, fine. Let them. Because the lesson doesn't live in paper. It lives here." He tapped his chest. "In every soldier who learned to breathe before they break. In every mechanic who fixes before they blame. In every one of you." A murmur rippled through the formation. No applause, no cheers. Just solemn agreement. That was exactly how she would have wanted it. 2 days later, the audit closed. Officially, the report declared the Reed line philosophically valuable but operationally inconsistent. Unapproved for doctrine. Unofficially, the auditors left uneasy. They walked into a base expecting to dismantle a myth, and instead they found a family. A culture built not on orders, but on quiet integrity. Colonel Vance found Thorne in his office that night. "They shut it down," he said simply. Thorne nodded. "I expected that." "But they didn't demote you," Vance added. Thorne looked up. "Why not?" The colonel smiled faintly. "Because every performance metric they measured improved. They couldn't argue with results." He placed a folded piece of paper on Thorne's desk. "Also, this came for you." Thorne unfolded it. A single line, scrawled in the familiar blocky handwriting. "Different continent, same silence, proud of you. ER." He closed his eyes, a slow breath escaping him. When he looked up, Vance was watching. "Sometimes," the colonel said softly, "a doctrine doesn't need approval to change everything." Thorne smiled faintly. "No, sir, it just needs believers." That night, long after everyone had gone, he walked to the range one last time. The stars stretched wide across the sky, endless and cold. He stood before the brass plate and whispered, "Still teaching, Chief, still listening." He thought about how fragile all of it was, truth, leadership, legacy, and how easily it could be buried under the noise of ambition. But he also thought about how deeply one voice, one example, could root itself in others, and how sometimes a whisper was louder than a shout. He turned toward the dark horizon, where distant lights from other bases shimmered faintly. Maybe, somewhere out there, another captain was standing in silence before a firing line. Maybe she'd reach them too. The wind shifted. The range flags fluttered once, then stilled. And in that stillness, Bryce Thorne smiled. The lesson hadn't ended. It had multiplied. How do you measure a life that was never lived for applause? That question haunted Captain Bryce Thorne for years after the audit. Time did what it always does. It thinned the noise, rewrote the stories, and buried the names. But not hers. Never hers. Evelyn Reed had become a ghost again, an echo in training manuals, a whispered name in classrooms, a half-censored reference in old files that nobody dared delete. And for Thorne, she was still a voice, one that rose in moments of doubt, cutting through the noise with quiet clarity. Watch, listen, don't speak unless it adds value. He built his career by that rule. He stopped climbing the ladder and started building it instead. He trained others, not to follow but to think. And the higher he rose, the more he realized how rare that was. 5 years passed. The Arsenal base had changed. New structures, new weapons, new recruits who hadn't even been born when Project Kron was buried. But the brass plate still remained, polished, untouched. No one dared remove it. Thorn, now Major Thorn, stood before it once again just before dawn. His hair had started to gray around the edges. His voice had grown quieter, his eyes steadier. Every class still began here. Every soldier under his command was required to stand before that plate and read those words aloud. Competence is quiet. Some understood them instantly. Others needed years. But all of them remembered. The world outside had grown faster, noisier. Technology filled the gaps that discipline once did. AI targeting, neural reflex implants, remote warfare, machines making choices soldiers used to. And Thorne saw what was being lost. Reflection, accountability, humanity. He sat in his office one night, staring at the new doctrine proposals from the Defense Directorate. Human factor elimination, that was the phrase. It meant removing people from the loop. It meant trusting systems over souls. He remembered Evelyn's voice. Mastery without morality is just engineering. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Not again." A month later, a message arrived. Classified Priority 1. A weapons AI test had gone wrong at a remote site in the Kazakh highlands. A targeting algorithm misidentified friendlies as hostiles, 3 dead, 2 wounded. They were calling it data corruption. He knew better. They were repeating history. Within hours, he requested to join the investigation team. Command hesitated, too many political layers, but when they reviewed his record, they agreed. They wanted him to fix what broke. He didn't tell them the truth. He didn't want to fix it. He wanted to understand it. The flight to Kazakhstan was long, quiet and heavy with déjà vu. Snow blanketed the landscape as the helicopter touched down at the remote outpost. The air bit like glass. Soldiers moved carefully, eyes low, voices soft. The atmosphere of a place that had seen something it couldn't explain. Inside the operations tent, engineers swarmed over shattered servers and burnt casings. Thorne walked straight to the weapons bay. And there, sitting on the workbench, was a rifle. Old, rugged, and unmistakable. The Kron rifle. He froze. It shouldn't have existed. The last known prototype was supposed to have been decommissioned, stripped, and destroyed years ago. But here it was. And next to it on the bench lay a notebook, handwritten in a familiar, deliberate script. He opened it slowly. The first line stopped his breath. "If you're reading this, you found the mess I couldn't stop." It was her. They resurrected Kron without asking the question it was built to answer. Not how far we can shoot, but how far we should. They automated the conscience out of the weapon. They made it flawless again. And in doing so, they broke it completely. He turned the page. "I'm here because I owe a boy 12 years of peace. Maybe this is how I pay it back." His throat tightened. "Don't try to find me. By the time you do, the rifle will be gone again. If you understand the silence, you'll know what to do next." The last line was scrawled hastily. "Keep the line straight, Major, ER." He stood there for a long time, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. Outside, snow fell against the tent in soft, relentless waves. She had been here. She worked on the system, tried to stop it, maybe even sabotaged it before it failed. And now she was gone again. He closed the notebook and looked at the rifle. For a moment, it almost felt alive. He ran a hand along the barrel, cold steel, expertly machined, timeless. And beneath it, etched faintly along the receiver, were 4 words. "Competence is quiet." He exhaled sharply. She left her mark even here, inside the machine that tried to erase her. 2 weeks later, after the investigation concluded, Thorne wrote his final report. He didn't call it an error. He didn't call it a malfunction. He called it what it was, the absence of accountability. When the review board read it, they called it philosophical. When the media leaked it, they called it controversial. But among soldiers, it spread like fire. Because in every unit, there were those who remembered her doctrine. Those who understood the difference between hitting and understanding, between following and listening. Soon, bases across the alliance began quietly reinstating Reed-style focus sessions. They didn't name them officially. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. A year later, Thorne was invited to speak at a leadership symposium in D.C. He almost declined. He hated speeches. But then he remembered her, the woman who never asked for a podium, only a moment of honesty. He stepped onto the stage in full uniform. No decorations beyond the basics, no medals pinned for display. He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of officers, dignitaries, and civilians. When he began to speak, his voice was calm, measured. "I once served under a woman whose name you'll never read in official doctrine," he said. "She taught me that a soldier's strength isn't in obedience, it's in awareness." He paused. "That awareness saved lives, it saved mine, and it's why I stand here now." He told her story, not the myth but the truth. How she rebuilt people, not weapons. How her silence taught louder than any speech. And when he finished, he said softly, "Competence doesn't need applause, it just needs courage." No one clapped at first. The room was too still. Then slowly people stood. Not in loud approval. In respect. It was the kind of moment she would have hated and earned anyway. Afterward, as the crowd filtered out, a young woman approached him. Civilian clothes, dusty boots, a pilot's badge on her collar. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "you don't know me, but I trained under someone named Reed. Afghanistan 5 years ago." She never said her first name. Thorne's breath caught. What was she like? The woman smiled faintly. Calm, sharp, scary as hell. She said she'd once trained a man who thought silence was weakness. Then she made me run drills until I understood it was. Thorne felt his throat tighten. Where is she now? The pilot hesitated. "I don't know, sir. Last I saw her, she was heading east. Said she had one last thing to finish." He nodded slowly. "That sounds like her." The pilot looked at him curiously. Was she really that good? Thorne smiled faintly. No, she was better. Years later, long after he retired, long after his hair had gone white, and his uniform hung in a quiet closet, Major Bryce Thorne returned to the desert. Range 12 still existed, though the base around it had changed hands, modernized, expanded. He walked alone, cane in hand, boots sinking slightly into the sand. The brass plate was still there. Still gleaming. Still clean. Someone was still maintaining it. He knelt slowly, tracing the words with his fingers. The metal was warm from the sun. And beneath it, half buried in the dust, he noticed something new. A small brass casing. Polished, empty. He picked it up, turning it in the light. There was an engraving around its rim. "Keep the line straight." His heart stilled. He looked up at the horizon, eyes misting. She'd been here. Recently. He smiled through the ache in his chest. "Still teaching, Chief," he whispered, "still listening." The wind rose, curling around him, gentle, warm, almost human. And in that wind, he swore he heard it again. The faintest echo of a rifle's report, rolling across the desert one last time. Soft, perfect. A reminder, not a warning. He stayed there until dusk. Then, with the setting sun painting the sand gold, he stood and saluted the empty range. Not as farewell, as acknowledgement, because Evelyn Reed was never really gone. She'd simply passed into the silence she had spent her life teaching others to respect. And as long as one soldier, one engineer, one mechanic still paused before acting, still breathed before speaking, her doctrine would live. Not in the manuals, not in the archives, but in the quiet between the orders, in that pause before the trigger breaks, in the space where conscience meets action. That's where she'd always been, and that's where she'd always stay. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And the world remembers the echo.